Cardone and Kiyosaki are not telling you the whole truth. Look, I know it's really popular for small channels like mine to attack big names in hopes of getting attention. That is not my intention here. I'm challenging them because I truly in my heart feel that many people, good people, with good intentions, are hanging their hats on certain things that they're saying, and that's not the best advice for their situation. Much of this discussion today is going to revolve around cash and debt. Now, how much cash to have on hand and how much debt to hold has always been a subject of hot debate in many of the circles that I run in. It was not that long ago when interest rates were very low. I was in a real estate mastermind where a ton of people were clamoring to get loans on their properties just for the sake of having the cash to be able to deploy to do deals. And I thought this was crazy, and I also felt like I was a lone voice in the wilderness. There's a few problems I have with this, and all of this has to do with managing risk. We're going to come back to that in a second. I got slapped around pretty hard in 2008, like really hard. And heading into that year, I had over just about $6.5 million in real estate when the economy turned sour. After the dust settled, I had lost over 75% of my real estate portfolio in about 8 months' time, turning my $6 million portfolio into about $1.5 million. It was a complete disaster. I had a lot of things going against me, and every single one of those things were self-made. Let me make that clear. I'm not blaming a bad economy, I'm not blaming the banks, I'm not blaming anyone other than myself. I made a series of horrible choices, and every single one of those choices were stacked up together, which is what led to my massive problems. If I was to pick out the biggest, most fundamental issues, was my relationship to cash and my relationship to debt. Now, I read the Rich Dad, Poor Dad books, and I learned all about good debt and bad debt. In fact, you should know I have an accounting degree with a minor in finance from Purdue, so I understand debt. And I understand how the effective use of leverage can really create some amazing returns. I get all that. One problem I came to realize is the simple definition of good debt and bad debt. Good debt is debt that is tied to an income-producing or appreciating asset, and bad debt being debt that is tied to depreciating assets, or basically nothing inherently tangible. So on its face, it sounds like a good ideology, a good strategy, right? Well, heading into 2008, I had a disproportionate amount of good debt over bad debt. In fact, as a matter of percentage, I had just 2.5% of bad debt in my portfolio compared to my total assets. Not bad, right? The rest of my debt, my good debt, amounted to 92% of my total assets. So everything should have been great for me, right? Heading into 2008, right? I mean, I had ample amounts of good debt compared to my bad debt. I had plenty of income producing and appreciating assets. I mean, I had 92 rental units and a modest home and not that many toys that made up my bad debt. I should have been set up well. Let's talk about the other problem, which is how to measure and manage risk. And this is what Robert Kiyosaki is not telling you in the good debt, bad debt discussion. Look, I'm not here to trounce anyone, but when you're passing yourself off as a financial guru, charging people upwards of $45,000 to be in a program whose advice is suspect, I'm sorry, but you deserve to get called out on that. The other problem that I have, and this is in the good debt, bad debt discussion, is it does not factor in how to measure risk. The legendary management expert Peter Drucker said, "You can't hope to manage what you can't measure." So because I didn't know how to measure risk, I couldn't manage it. I didn't manage it. And as a result, when things went sideways in the economy, I got ran over. And it was only by sheer luck and some real wheeling and dealing and some hot negotiating that I was able to keep what little that I had. A few years after my foreclosure mess, I was still climbing out of this smoking wreckage, what was once my rental business. I had negotiated payment arrangements with all my creditors and all the deficiency judgments I had against me, so things were getting better. I will tell you this, I'm pretty proud of the fact that I did not declare bankruptcy, although many people said I probably should have, and admittedly, it would have gotten me back on track and to a solid footing a lot faster. I just thought it wasn't the best option for me. I feel that like bankruptcy should be an absolute last resort rather than just a method of hitting the reset button. But it did mean I would have to work really hard to get all those people paid. I had to figure out my fastest path to cash, which for me was opening up a property management company and doing maintenance on those properties. I was working, and I was working hard. I was working really long hours, like 14, 16, 18 hours at a time, and it was an absolute freaking grind. Ironically, this wasn't all that different from what I was doing before. The only difference is I had a $4.5 million lesson under my belt. Now, during the good weeks, and I mean good weeks here in air quotes, which meant I was working 7 days a week, I was bringing in anywhere between $1,000 to $1,500 a day, which might sound like a lot, but when you owe over a few $1,000,000 to people, it felt like I was getting nowhere. But I kept at it, and little by little, I started gaining ground. So not only was I making money, but I figured out a concept of stacking and tracking. What was I stacking and tracking? I was stacking and tracking cash. Now, stacking cash means putting money aside for no other reason than just to have it. Think of this as the moat around your castle. This is the fence around your house. This is the lock on your front door. These are the bars on your windows, okay? That's stacking cash. Tracking cash is knowing how much cash I had on hand at any given time. Not just where it is right now, but where it was at the end of last month, at the end of last year, and the year before that. Tracking cash wasn't simply logging in every day and seeing what my balance was in my checking account. I was writing down the balance at the end of each period, generally every month, and tracking the balance and paying attention to the trend over time. Was the balance going up? Was it going down? Was it roughly staying the same? We're going to come back to this more in a second. But when it comes to cash, I am absolutely fanatical about it. You've heard of health insurance, right? We all have. Cash is your wealth insurance. And just like your health insurance where you pay a monthly premium, your wealth insurance requires you to pay a monthly premium too. And that premium comes in the form of inflation. I hear a lot of people gripe to me that they don't stack cash because they're losing purchasing power to inflation. There's a couple problems with this. First, you're assuming there's an opportunity cost that is in excess of your ability to offset the risk of not having cash on hand. Let me say that again. You're assuming that there's an opportunity cost, basically you're losing money, that's in excess of your ability to offset the risk of you not having your cash on hand. What I mean is when you deploy all of your available cash into opportunities, you're not calculating into the equation the risk of being cash poor when life shows up at your door. Let's say you have all your cash deployed and some life event shows up. It could be needing brakes for your car, or sales are low that particular month and you need to make payroll. Or what about lightning strikes your office and fries all the computers and your copy machine and even your Keurig. Oh my gosh, no coffee, right? But let's look at the other side of the equation where the world goes to crap and there's a ton of opportunities that you could massively take advantage of, but you can't because all of your cash is deployed. So now you have to do what? Now you got to shuffle money, and now you're not spending time doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. You're managing money, and I don't want to spend my time or energy managing money. I'm not a super huge fan of Grant Cardone, but I do think he's right about this. Spending your time and managing and shuffling money around is not the best use of yours, mine, or anyone's time. The other reason I hear from folks who don't stack cash is they assume that they're going to be able to use their lines of credit or credit cards if they get in a bind. I want you to keep this in mind. The reason I got into so much trouble back in 2008 is because I had all of my cash deployed. And when trouble came, all of those lines of credit that I had been relying on, guess what? They started to dry up. And the only people who could make anything at all happen back then were people with cash or access to capital. And those people were very, very few. Remember, we're talking about stacking and tracking cash. We're talking about wealth insurance. Well, let's face it. Do you have car insurance? Do you have homeowners insurance? Did you use it last week? Did you use it last month? Did you use it within the last few years? Maybe some of you have, but the reality is most of us have insurance that we don't use or don't get an opportunity to use. You're using it to offset your risk, and that's exactly how I want you to treat your cash, as a buffer between life's disruptive events and the compounding of your wealth. The longer you can give your wealth to grow without it being interrupted, the more you'll have on the back end. That's exactly how Warren Buffett amassed such a fortune. The guy hardly ever sold anything. At 50 years old, he had a net worth of around $300 million. Not a small sum for most of us, but nothing at all compared to the $90 billion he wound up with before he started giving it all away the last few years. The reason it grew is because of the eighth wonder of the world, compounded growth. Buffett's secret? He never interrupted the compounding. And cash and a healthy balance sheet will allow you to keep the compounding going. I hear guys like Cardone saying cash is trash, and while that makes a good soundbite, I promise you, Grant Cardone has plenty of cash on his balance sheet. He also has an incentive to say things like that. Look, number one, he doesn't want you to have cash because he wants you to put your money into his private equity firm. Number two, it's disruptive. It's controversial. And even though I will likely never have as large a platform as Cardone, not that I particularly want one, let's face it, I'm talking about it. And if it's one thing I can't take away from Grant Cardone, he is a brilliant marketer. And part of being a brilliant marketer, especially online, is going away from mainstream and being disruptive. Now, don't get me wrong. I like Grant Cardone when it comes to marketing, and I've learned a lot from him when it comes to marketing himself and marketing Cardone Capital, which is his private equity firm. But if you hang your hat on the idea that every dollar you have has to be invested, you're leaving yourself massively overexposed to risk, particularly when it comes to black swan events. If you're not familiar with the concept of a black swan is what author Nassim Taleb refers to as highly improbable, highly consequential events. It's an event that's impossible to predict, but has deep, meaningful consequences for a person, for a business, an industry, an economy, or even a country. And there are plenty of examples of black swan events all throughout modern history. 9/11 is a great modern example. But we also have other examples like the dot-com bubble, the mortgage crisis of 2008, COVID-19, or even the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All are examples of highly improbable events with deep and meaningful consequences. These are the types of risks you can't possibly predict, but they are risks that bring consequences that you have to be prepared for. It's not a question of if another black swan is coming, but when it will come and how you specifically will be impacted. And when an event like this happens in an industry or an economy, one of three things will happen to a business. The company pulls ahead, the company falls behind, or the company goes away. Let me be clear. The next black swan event is already in motion, and no one, not you, not me, not Oprah, not Tom Cruise, not Ricky Bobby, can predict with 100% accuracy what it will be or when it will come. But it's not the black swan itself which determines whether you pull ahead, fall behind, or die. You're the one that determines that. So in my case, what was my relationship to debt that caused me not to manage my risk better? Well, I use debt as a crutch rather than a tool. I use it as a crutch rather than a ladder. And when you use debt as a crutch, it opens you up to all sorts of risks. So what kind of risks are there? I'm going to do a separate video on managing risk, but for right now, I'm just going to reference something called asymmetric risk. This is the type of risk people, companies, and governments take where the potential for downside is far greater than the potential upside. This is one of the main reasons it makes sense for me to stack cash in lieu of paying down debt, because it reduces my asymmetric risk. I'd rather have immediate access to my cash and have debt than to pay down my debt, which would leave me exposed in a weakened cash position. I don't want to find myself like I did in 2008 with a sudden need for cash because of a black swan or similarly disruptive event, and now I'm at the mercy of a bank or an underwriter or leaning on high loan constant debt like credit cards. Look, I'm not going to lie. It takes tremendous discipline to stack cash because it just has this strange ability to leak out of whatever bucket you put it in. Let's face it, one of the main reasons it's so hard to stack cash is because it's the most liquid form of wealth there is, and it's so easy for it to disappear. When you get cash in, let's look at it from a balance sheet perspective. It can go to 6 different places, right? You can spend it, you can save it, you can invest it, you could pay bills with it, you can donate it, or you could pay down and deleverage debt. We're going to cover that in more detail in another video. We have already covered a lot of ground here. But a question I often get from coaching clients is how much cash should I stack and when should I actually start paying down debt? I will tell you it always makes sense to stack cash in lieu of paying down debt. I like to stack $2 of cash for every $1 of debt that I'm paying down. Why is that? Because it helps manage my risk. If you have the debt already, that's fine. The decision's already been made and you have to own that decision. But stacking cash is keeping me out of hot water, and it keeps me compliant with my lenders so I can at the very least live to fight another day. And at best, I can pull ahead in a way that's in alignment with my vision. Not only do I stack cash, remember, I also track cash. I don't obsess over it, but I do know from month to month where my cash position is so I can improve it. And because I'm tracking it, I can tell you where my cash balance was 3 years ago, and I can tell you what the trend is and make sure it continues to grow. And it's that cash that's going to allow me not only to survive the next Black Swan event, but to pull ahead and to thrive. One final thought. I know guys like Kiyosaki and Cardone are big and they have brilliant marketing platforms. Don't be afraid to think for yourself. Don't be afraid to challenge something just because the big name is saying it and they've got legions of people following them. That's all I have for today, everybody. If you found this to be helpful, please hit the like button. If you like content like this for you, the business owner, please hit subscribe. I'll see you next time.